Welcome to the 27th episode of Always Remember World War II Through Veterans' Eyes, Remembrances of Richard V. Morgan. A star athlete, first at Aspinwall High School, then at Waynesburg College in Pennsylvania, Richard V. Morgan felt the call to duty when his country was attacked at Pearl Harbor and joined the Marines. Morgan fought in some of the Pacific's bloodiest battles at Tarawa, Saipan, and Tinian Islands. At Tarawa, he fought alongside Medal of Honor recipient Lieutenant Alexander Bonnyman Jr., supplying him with demolition charges as they took a large Japanese bunker filled with 200 to 300 Imperial soldiers. At Saipan, Morgan narrowly survived a 15-hour last-ditch Banzai charge of 3,000 Japanese soldiers. At Tinian Island, Morgan spent weeks trying to clear out Japanese resistance from the island's high caves. Selected for officer school, Morgan's days were brightened by his morning encounters with one of the most celebrated figures of the 20th century. This is Richard V. Morgan's World War II story. During the 1990s, while serving as a teacher with the Department of Defense dependent schools in Bad Kreuznach, Germany, my family and I visited many of the sites associated with World War II, from the beaches of Normandy, where the D-Day landings took place, to the Ardennes forest, where the Battle of the Bulge was fought, to the death camps of Auschwitz, Buchenwald, and Dachau. We saw what was at stake in World War II, when not only democracy in the U.S., but throughout the world hung in the balance. I began to write to World War II veterans to thank them for their service. I sent them pictures of the sites we visited. I invited them to share their stories with me, and I promised to keep them alive in the classes that I taught. What I never could have anticipated was that veterans shared their stories with their buddies and printed my letters in their reunion newsletters. I was soon corresponding with approximately 140 World War II veterans, 20 of whom received the nation's highest honor, the Medal of Honor. I had more material than I could ever use in the classes I taught. To keep my promise, I wrote Always Remember World War II Through Veterans' Eyes and launched this series of podcasts, which are based upon the book. Despite being freshmen at Waynesburg College in Pennsylvania, Richard V. Morgan and three of his buddies hitched a ride to the Marine Recruit Depot in Pittsburgh following Pearl Harbor. All three men figured they'd have little trouble in passing the physical exam, as they were all on the college football team and were in excellent shape. Morgan was surprised then and a little disappointed when his two buddies failed their eye tests and he was sent alone to the Marine boot camp on Parris Island, South Carolina. In boot camp, Morgan earned an expert sharpshooter medallion on the firing range before he was transferred to the Fleet Marine Force at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. By late 1942, Morgan was on the move aboard a troop train headed to San Diego, California. Instead of boarding the USS Matsonia, once they arrived in San Diego, as everyone else on the train did, the young Marines in Morgan's train car were placed under quarantine. One of the men in the car had come down with infectious spinal meningitis. Their car sat on the rail siding as the young Marines watched everyone else march up the gangplank. A doctor finally examined them and declared them free to travel on the day the ship was to depart for British Samoa. Morgan served with the 2nd Battalion, 8th Regiment of the 2nd Marine Division. Once in British Samoa, the Marines received additional training while also establishing a front and second line of defense around the city of Apia, defending it from a Japanese attack. Following British Samoa, the 2nd Marine Division was sent to Paikakariki in New Zealand to regroup and to retrain, as well as to provide security to both New Zealand and Australia, with the Japanese still aggressively moving across the Pacific. Morgan found it a relaxed assignment. The only fighting then was isolated clashes involving drunken Marines, Morgan wrote. With the capital city of Wellington readily accessible via a narrow-gauge railroad, the Marines were given frequent one-day leaves. Of primary importance was strict obeyance of orders, to be back on the train before midnight or face 3 days of brig time, which resulted in a head shave and hard labor under armed guards. While training at Foxton for the upcoming invasion of the Gilbert Islands, the Marine Corps broke a record with a 50-mile march under full packs to Camp Paikakariki. On November 20th, 1943, the U.S. Marine Corps launched its first amphibious operation in the Central Pacific at the tiny atoll of Tarawa in the Gilbert Islands. Because the island was so remote, U.S. intelligence was not fully aware of how well the Japanese had fortified the atoll. Tarawa was defended with over 5,000 Imperial Japanese Marines, 400 specialists, an airfield, 37 mm to 293 mm guns, light tanks, bunkers, and hidden pillboxes, all on a flat island just 2 miles long and 800 yards wide at its broadest point. Over 100 American warships, landing craft, and transports were used to invade the atolls of Tarawa and Macon. The battle for Tarawa would cost the Americans dearly. Because of the shallow shores surrounding the atoll, the landing craft had to cover 10 miles before reaching shore, passing Japanese defenses and a coral reef. The Japanese guns opened fire on the first 2 waves of Marines, causing heavy casualties. Hand-to-hand combat awaited the Marines, who made it to shore. During the 3-day, 76-hour battle, some 6,400 Japanese, Korean, and American lives would be lost, nearly 1,000 of which were Marines. The battle was so bloody that it ignited a public outcry back home when enormous losses were reported for such a small, seemingly insignificant island. Richard Morgan was in the initial assault on Tarawa, whose code name was Red Beach 3. He recalled, "D-Day began with high expectations and a highly unusual steak breakfast aboard ship." Spirits were high as the Marines thought they would quickly take the island. Morgan was even pleased that his battalion had been chosen to be in the initial assault, assuring him that he would see some action. That action came immediately as the Marines found themselves under heavy fire. "I was in the first wave of Higgins' boats to hang up in the coral reef. We had to wade about 500 yards to the beach through heavy crossfire from a pier and partially sunken Japanese boat. Machine guns lined the half-sunken freighter 250 yards to the Marines' left, while snipers struck at the Marines from poles supporting the pier about 100 yards to their right. Through the shoulder-deep water, Morgan carried his weapons and ammunition, as well as 6 lightweight canvas bags to be used as frontline panel markers to guide Allied support aircraft. 2 of Morgan's friends were hit before he reached shore. His friend, Spider Arnold of Sontag, Mississippi, was about 10 feet in front of Morgan when he was hit in the ribs, but said he would make it all right and for me to continue to the beach. Morgan gave him 4 of his canvas panel markers to help him remain buoyant. He then spotted one of the Japanese snipers from the pier. Morgan's first shot failed to go off, but his second shot hit the sniper. Another of Morgan's friends, Stanley Backus of Danville, Illinois, was soon hit in the neck, but assured Morgan he too was going to be okay. Weeks later, we learned that both men made it out successfully, but I never saw them again. Morgan kept his head just above the water line as he continued to move forward. He was only about 150 yards from shore when the barbed wire entanglement in front of him was destroyed by an explosion. Morgan now had to clear a path to the sea wall. Under fire the whole time, Morgan estimated it took him between 2 to 3 hours to wade from the reef to the shore. Everything was disorganized ashore, so thinking that most of the Marines had already crossed the airfield, I jumped the wall and I darted across what turned out to be a taxi strip. Morgan was grazed with a bullet that ripped past his arm and body, leaving a superficial wound on the inside of his arm about an inch below the elbow bone. I barely noticed it because it was so slight and nothing like those received by the dead and severely wounded lying on the beach and in the water. I never reported it, but I do have a scar." He was now alone, and it took him several hours to locate the other men from his platoon. Once he was reunited, Morgan spent much of the first night assisting Corporal Shook as he searched for a wounded sergeant who had been given a field telephone. They eventually found him in no man's land, sitting alongside a burnt-out Japanese tank. Despite having to run past a burning Japanese mess hall that lit up the area and being pinned down at one point to the back of a tree stump by machine gun fire, the two men eventually ran the line from the G Company command post to the tank where the wounded sergeant hid, and back to the F Company command post along the rear of the sea wall. Morgan never learned the name of the wounded sergeant or whether he survived the battle, but he displayed incredible valor. "This extremely brave and badly wounded sergeant stayed with the telephone and kept the F and G Company commanders and Majors Crow and Chamberlain alerted to the Japanese attacks." It was just as well that Morgan's assignment kept him busy all night. Even if he had been in his foxhole, there was no way he would have gotten any rest, not with the night being so full of horrible sounds, the rifle cracks, the pitiful cries of the badly wounded, the shouts of the enemy, and the defiant replies of the remaining Marines. Twice Morgan carried 10-gallon cans of water to an aid station to aid the parched and wounded Marines, dodging sniper fire as he did so. The 2 days that followed were filled with intense fighting as Morgan and his platoon cleared out reinforced Japanese pillboxes and bunkers. In doing so, he lost several more friends. A good friend from Hereford, Texas, Junior Thumper Mathias, was shot dead by a Japanese sniper. Lieutenant Alexander Bonnyman Jr., an engineer, was killed while leading a charge to destroy a huge Japanese bunker that had been ordered to be taken no matter what the cost. The bunker had been made of sand, concrete, and coconut logs, and was thought to contain hundreds of Japanese soldiers. Bonnyman voluntarily crawled 40 yards in front of his line to place demolitions at the entrance of a large Japanese emplacement, protecting the heavily garrisoned bunker. After the explosion, Bonnyman led the assault, seizing the top of the bunker while directing more demolition charges alongside its 2 entrances. Once atop the bunker, Bonnyman fiercely defended his position until he was charged by Japanese soldiers and fell mortally wounded. In the assault on the bunker, Morgan brought up the demolition charges. "A heavy wooden box of grenades to be dropped down to the air vents once the top emplacement was won. Once the top of the bunker was taken and charges dropped through the vents, some 200 to 300 Japs came streaming out a backside portal and were mowed down by rifle fire by a machine gunner." Luck had been with the Marines. If the fleeing Japanese had turned the other direction and charged them, Morgan believed they could have easily overrun our undermanned positions. Although he only met Lieutenant Bonnyman that morning as he led the attack on the fortified bunker, Morgan wrote that, "Throughout my life, his memory has clung to me, and he has been a humbling inspiration." Lieutenant Bonnyman was later awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor posthumously for his actions. By the afternoon of the 3rd day, the Battle of Tarawa had ended for the 2nd Battalion. The survivors of the 2nd Battalion were taken from Tarawa to nearby island that had been virtually untouched by action. The exhausted men cleaned themselves off in the ocean before collapsing in their pup tents. The following day, Morgan and the others returned to the USS Haywood, feeling numb but fortunate. "I vividly remember and realized how fortunate I was when climbing up the rope netting on the aft end of the ship and seeing bodies of fellow U.S. Marines who had died of wounds being buried at sea on the forward end of the Haywood." The sad sea burials continued almost every day as the Haywood made its long 2,000-mile return to Hawaii. Back in Hawaii, Morgan enjoyed a brief respite from the fierce fighting in the Pacific as his battalion received new replacements and was reorganized for their heroism. It wasn't long before the battalion was sent off again to the new fights in Saipan and Tinian. The Allied island hopping strategy including liberated the Mariana Islands of Saipan, Guam, and Tinian, which would enable Allied long-range B-29 bomber squadrons to strike the Japanese mainland. The Allies focused first on Saipan because of its air base. Heavy bombardment by air and sea began striking Saipan's beaches at 5:45 a.m. Less than 3 hours later, 700 amphibious landing craft delivered 8,000 Marines to its shores. The 32,000 Japanese soldiers defending the island fiercely resisted the invaders. By day's end, the Marines had suffered 2,000 casualties, but their forces were soon bolstered by an additional 18,000 Marines who landed on the mountainous island. For the next 3 weeks, the island witnessed savage fighting, ending with a last-ditch 15-hour Banzai charge of 3,000 Japanese soldiers through the American lines. After hand-to-hand fighting and the support of the Marine howitzers, the Japanese onslaught was finally halted. Morgan's 2nd Battalion landed too far north of its assigned beach and had to move southward as well as inland along the beach as a result. On the beach, our casualties were so high, including Battalion Commander Major Crow and our platoon leader, Sergeant Lynch. The Japanese were so close that Morgan could hear them calling out, "Marines, tonight you die!" Morgan joined a group of 5 or 6 Marines who pulled a 37mm heavily wheeled pack howitzer up the sandy beach and into a tank trap. We moved the 37mm to a strategic spot, and we supplied it with canister-laden ammunition. It did the job in stopping the enemy attack and staved off a potential breakthrough to the vulnerable beachfront. Morgan was nearly killed while on patrol, walking on a jungle trail in Saipan, when a suicidal Japanese soldier, strapped with explosives, jumped out at him. The Japanese soldier was part of a 15-hour last-ditch Banzai charge of 3,000 Japanese soldiers through the American lines. I was slow in hitting the deck in response to the cries of the Marines in back of the Jap. I received minor pieces of shrapnel and coral in my back. I was treated hastily by our corpsmen, and I never lost any duty time. Recalling the seriously wounded Marines whose cries had kept him up all night at Tarawa, Morgan deemed his wounds not serious enough for a Purple Heart and refused mention for one. After the terror of the Banzai charge, Japanese resistance on Saipan effectively ended. But even as Saipan was declared secured on January 9th, a terrible tragedy was about to unfold. Emperor Hirohito feared capture of the island's remaining Japanese civilians might provide the Allies with a powerful propaganda tool, especially if they were given humane treatment as prisoners. Emperor Hirohito ordered the island's remaining civilians, who had gathered at Point Marpi, the island's most northern point, to commit suicide to evade being taken prisoner. Putting their faith in Emperor Hirohito's promise that their souls would be justly rewarded in the afterlife, hundreds of Japanese civilians and soldiers ignored the American promises carried out over loudspeakers that they would be treated fairly and flung themselves off the cliffs to their deaths. Marines watched helplessly from another cliff as about 100 Japanese on the beach bowed to them, changed into clean clothing, unfurled the Japanese flag, and then set off the hand grenades they held close to their bellies. In just over 3 weeks of fighting, the Americans had suffered 16,525 casualties compared to 30,000 dead Japanese. The devastating news of Saipan's capture resulted in the resignation of the Japanese Prime Minister Hideki Tojo and his cabinet. As a senior naval advisor told Emperor Hirohito, it was clear now that hell is on us. It would soon get much worse. Saipan provided the Americans at last with an island so close to Japan that they could easily carry out airstrikes. Within 2 weeks they would soon possess another one, which would become their busiest of the war. Located just 3 miles from Saipan, Tinian was invaded by the Marines on July 24th. Because of its rocky coastline, Tinian had natural obstacles for any amphibious landing. The Japanese expected the Americans to land on the southwestern beaches of a Tinian town where they had built up their defenses. To avoid what would otherwise have been heavy losses, the Americans chose instead to land in the northwestern corner of the island on 2 small beaches between pointed cliffs. The Japanese had few defenses at the chosen beaches. To keep it that way, the Americans carried out a ruse, acting as if their invasion fleet was going to land in a Tinian town, even sending a fleet there, which started towards shore and then retreated as the Japanese began firing their shore batteries. Richard V. Morgan landed on Tinian on the second day of the invasion, fighting on White Beach. The Marines declared the island secured in just 9 days of fighting, but Morgan questioned the proclamation. We experienced nightly Banzai attacks, a mild breakthrough, nighttime Shinto, temple tripwires, and cliff cave cleanups of stubborn Japs. Morgan's battalion was called upon to eliminate the Japanese resistance pockets, mostly located in caves high up in the island's cliffs. He recalled spending several weeks atop the cliffs trying to drive out Japanese soldiers who held civilian hostages inside them. All trails up the cliffs were guarded and laced with fluorescent grenades fixed to tripwires. Thirst was a factor for the Japanese, so we perched on vantage points above the caves and we took pot shots as they attempted to obtain water from pools of rainfall. We even attempted to force them out by pouring gas and oil down through rock fissures and ignited the fluids with grenade explosions. Also, interpreters with foghorns tried to coax them into surrender. This too failed. Finally, the Marines received the order to enter the caves and clean out the resistance. Casualties were inevitable, for the Japs refused to give up. The Americans used napalm against the unsuspecting Japanese for the first time during the war at Tinian. The incendiary bombs were dropped from aircraft which took off from the landing strips the Americans had required at Saipan. American losses were minimal when compared to the Japanese losses. 389 Americans killed and 1,816 wounded, while the Japanese suffered 6,050 killed and over 200 taken prisoner. After the cleanup operations ended at Tinian, Morgan's battalion were sent back to Saipan's Magician Bay to begin training for the invasion of Okinawa. But Morgan wasn't there for long before he was given orders to return to the States for officer training. His friends envious but happy for him, Morgan joined 10 or 12 other Marines aboard a C-27 plane for home. The C-27 stopped to refuel on tiny Johnston Island, and the Marines were given a chance to disembark at Hickman Field on Oahu Island in Hawaii. It was there that someone ransacked my sea bag, taking some of my souvenirs, Morgan recalled bitterly. The war in the Pacific had ended forever for Morgan. Initially, Morgan was sent to Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, for officer training, before he was sent for additional instruction to Princeton University. At Princeton, our class marched to meals and had inspection and drills every morning before a weekend leave. Weekend leaves were taken to New York City and Philadelphia, which were both easy to reach, for a uniformed U.S. Marine hitchhiker. Morgan recalled that a highlight on his walk to morning classes was the frequent encounters with the world's most intelligent human, Dr. Albert Einstein, who was apparently doing research at Princeton. He would always greet us with a cheerful, "Good morning, boys," and he seemed pleased with our response, "Good morning, sir." Morgan's classes were interrupted when he began suffering from a delayed tropical disease, which put him in the hospital for several weeks. He was still hospitalized when the news came that an atomic bomb had been dropped. The B-29 Superfortress bombers that dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki had both taken off from Tinian airstrips, which had become the busiest of the war in the Pacific. Morgan greeted the news with relief. Now his buddies would come home too. Upon his release from the hospital, Morgan had enough points to be discharged from the U.S. Naval Base at Bainbridge, near Baltimore, Maryland. The war was finally over for Morgan, though even 50 years later, he still found that hardly a day goes by that the happenings in that World War II battle do not flash through my mind or enter my thoughts. Upon returning home, Morgan went to work for 14 years as a reporter and photographer for the Observer-Reporter, before beginning a 26-year career with the First Federal Savings and Loan of Greene County, retiring as vice president. Morgan married his sweetheart, Margaret Bell Wiley, and the couple had 8 children and 25 grandchildren. They were married for 56 years until Morgan's death. Richard Morgan was also a charter member of the Tri-County Leatherneck Association.
Although there are oceans we must cross and mountains that we must climb, I know every gate must have a law. So pray that our Lord is nothing but time.
Our song today, Till Then, was a plea, presumably by a soldier off to fight to war, for his sweetheart to wait for him until he could get back home. Like many war-themed songs, it enjoyed great popularity when it came out in 1944. Recorded by the Mills Brothers, it reached the Billboard magazine bestseller chart on September 21st, 1944, and lasted for 3 weeks on the chart. If you liked this podcast of Always Remember World War II Through Veterans' Eyes, please leave us a review on whatever podcast network you use. The entire series is still available online, so please be sure to check out our previous episodes and be sure to tell your friends. You can find the companion book on Amazon.com. Contact me at drjohnu64@gmail.com. If you'd be interested in having me give one of my free multimedia World War II presentations to your group or organization. Available presentations include Liberators of the Holocaust, Medal of Honor recipients of World War II, Minorities in World War II, D-Day, America's Longest Day, Day of Infamy, Attack at Pearl Harbor, Pacific Island Hopping, World War II's Deadliest Battles, A World War II Soldier's Daily Life, and stories from Always Remember World War II Through Veterans' Eyes. Each book talk features stories and photographs of veterans from my book, along with original World War II photos of the events they describe. All talks are free. I'm located in Rockford, Illinois. I do ask for travel expenses beyond a 1-hour radius. The last new episode of Always Remember World War II Through Veterans' Eyes will be released January 10th, 2026, and will feature Donald Chase, a poet and soldier, as he recalled fighting in Nazi Germany and Korea. I'm going to be launching a new podcast series on my other great passion, wildlife ethology, sometime in July 2026. The series will feature profiles of African wildlife and will include personal encounters from my extensive travels in the heart of Africa. For more first-person World War II history, I strongly recommend Fernando Prieto's POV World War II podcasts. In partnership with Rutgers Oral History Archives, Prieto adds cinematic dramatization and You Are There storytelling to bring the first-person remembrances of World War II veterans to life in an unforgettable fashion. If you enjoyed my series, I think you'll really like Prieto's POV World War II. Give it a listen. Thank you for remembering our World War II veterans. As long as we speak their names and tell their stories, the brave veterans of World War II will live on. It's the least we can do for the sacrifices they made for the freedom we treasure today. Thank you for listening.